By the late 1990s, the Rostov region in Russia had gained notoriety as the serial killer capital of the world. Over the previous 2 decades, a series of such killers had emerged and terrorized the area. Many wondered why this was happening to their country, especially considering that serial killers had long been thought of as a uniquely American phenomenon. This disturbing trend seemed deeply rooted in the aftermath of the former Soviet Union. During a devastating famine, 6 million people perished, and there were reports of survivors resorting to consuming the corpses of their own relatives. In many cases, human flesh was even traded. Children raised amid these horrors often lost their grip on reality. Their trauma led to a sharp increase in violent deaths in the years that followed. Among these cases, more than 50 murders were eventually linked to one man, later dubbed the Butcher of Rostov. Most of his victims were children and teenagers aged 9 to 19, both boys and girls, and the horrifying crime scenes he left behind were traumatizing even for the most seasoned officers. The first body was discovered in June 1982. A villager from Donleskos was gathering firewood when he stumbled upon the skeletal remains of a child. The body was naked, but the ears were still intact enough to reveal earrings. From this and the remaining hair on the skull, it was evident the victim was a young girl. The coroner found that the girl's ribs had been broken by a sharp object, and there were over 40 stab wounds. Additionally, her eye sockets were misshapen, suggesting the killer may have attempted to gouge them out. The report also noted evidence suggesting possible abuse. Using children's books found nearby and fingerprints from the body, investigators identified her as Lyubov Biryuk, a 13-year-old girl from the village of Donskoy who had been missing for months. Investigators began interviewing friends and mentally ill youths in the area. They soon identified an adult male with a prior rape conviction as a potential suspect. However, before they could question him, he took his own life. At the time, locals and authorities believed the case had been solved, but it soon became clear that this was only the beginning. 2 months later, a railway worker in Shakhty found another naked, skeletal body near the tracks. Investigators quickly determined that this time the victim was an adult woman. She had been positioned similarly to the previous victim, had multiple stab wounds, and, once again, her eye sockets had been removed. They reviewed missing persons reports but found no match. A month later, another man collecting wood 16 kilometers from the previous scene came across a third female body, this one face down. Like the others, she was already in an advanced state of decomposition. The autopsy revealed a matching pattern of stab wounds and eye mutilation, suggesting the same killer. Authorities began seeing a connection, but chose not to alert the local press. Instead, they formed a small task force of just 10 men, each assigned full-time to track down the perpetrator. Soon after, a fourth body was discovered near the second crime scene. The stab wounds were identical, and the same disturbing mutilation of the eyes was evident. Investigators began to profile the suspect as a deeply disturbed individual, possibly a smoker with a fixation on eyes, though they weren't sure if it stemmed from superstition or fetish. Whatever the reason, it was clearly significant to the killer. More bodies continued to surface. Although local authorities publicly denied it, it was becoming undeniable that they were dealing with a serial killer. The brutality, frequency, and sexually driven nature of the crimes left little doubt. The next body found was that of an 8-year-old boy bearing the same horrific signs. A 19-year-old named Yuri Cherbanov was mistakenly arrested for this and other prior murders. He was taken in for intense questioning without legal representation. Yuri was physically and mentally tortured for days until he confessed to 7 murders and supposedly added 4 more cold cases. The wrongful arrest became even more apparent when they brought Yuri to the crime scenes. He had no idea where the bodies had been found. Still, Yuri remained imprisoned, and the only thing that could prove his innocence was another murder. Tragically, that's exactly what happened. In a forested area of Rostov, a severely decomposed female body was found. Her nipples had been removed in a particularly brutal manner, with signs indicating they were torn off by the killer's teeth. Her abdomen had been destroyed and her eyes gouged out in a brutal fashion. Unfortunately, due to the level of decomposition, medical examiners concluded the body had been there for months, meaning Yuri could still be considered a suspect. He wouldn't be released until years later. In October 1983, yet another female body was found, though it was unclear when she had been killed. The similarities with previous victims were unmistakable, but this time the killer had escalated. The victim had been eviscerated, and her organs were missing, never to be recovered. Curiously, her eyes had been left untouched. By 1984, the body count continued to rise. Investigators were growing desperate, and wrongful arrests kept happening, worsened by the Russian authorities' harsh interrogation methods. In March that year, 10-year-old Sergei Pavlov was found dead, but for the first time, there was a witness. A young boy reported seeing Sergei with a tall man who had sunken cheeks, stiff knees, large feet, and glasses. While authorities searched for this suspect, another victim emerged, 17-year-old Lyudmila Alexeyeva, who had been stabbed 39 times. Not long after, a mother and daughter were also killed with knives and a hammer. The year 1984 was a nightmare for the task force, with killings escalating and false confessions pouring in. By now, the unknown maniac had killed 24 victims. A small breakthrough came when grey hairs, possibly the killers, were found at a recent crime scene. Dozens of suspects were followed, detained, and questioned, and officers were stationed undercover at bus and train stations across Rostov. Eventually, they found their first promising lead. An undercover officer noticed a man chatting with a teenage girl, then moving on to sit beside another young woman. Finding this behavior suspicious, the officer questioned the man, who introduced himself as Andrei Chikatilo, a machine company manager on a business trip. When asked about his interactions with those women, Andrei said he used to be a teacher and missed interacting with young people. The officer let him go but kept tailing him. He watched as Chikatilo approached several more women before being caught hiring a sex worker for public intercourse. At that point, the officer arrested him for indecent behavior. At the time of arrest, Andrei was carrying a briefcase that contained petroleum jelly, a large kitchen knife, rope, and a dirty towel. The police were convinced they had caught the killer. To confirm, they tested his blood, but it came back as type A, while the killer's semen samples were type AB. Additionally, Andrei was a member of the Communist Party and seen as an upstanding citizen. Still, some investigators had doubts and kept him in custody for several days. Despite multiple interrogations, they couldn't get a confession. At most, Andrei admitted to having sexual weaknesses, so he was eventually released. Surprisingly, not long after, he was arrested again, this time for theft at work, earning a 3-month sentence. Meanwhile, psychiatric experts compiled a 7-page profile on the Rostov maniac. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky theorized that they should be looking for a man aged 25 to 50 with sexual dysfunction. The removal of the victim's eyes reflected deep self-esteem issues. He didn't want them to see him. The brutal mutilations were an expression of this frustration, possibly serving to intensify his arousal. Undoubtedly, the killer was a sadist who required cruelty to be sexually fulfilled. Dr. Bukhanovsky described him as impulsive, committing murders out of compulsion and becoming depressed when he refrained. He noted that the killer did not suffer from major mental illnesses like schizophrenia, but was a solitary, calculating individual who knew exactly what he was doing. By mid-1985, the murders seemed to stop for a time, but eventually resumed. In Moscow, 3 boys were mutilated, one of them decapitated. Despite the change in location, the murders clearly matched the same pattern. When killings started in Moscow, those in Rostov ceased. Later, investigators learned that semen can sometimes have a different blood type than saliva or actual blood, explaining the previous test discrepancies and changing everything. By July 1992, the body count had surpassed 30. The latest victim, 13-year-old Viktor Petrov, was found in Rostov's botanical garden. The press began openly criticizing the years-long investigation and demanding resignations. The task force deployed 350 officers across the region. Several of them reported a suspicious man. When investigators checked his name, they immediately remembered the previously inconclusive blood test and realized the truth. That man was Andrei Chikatilo. Witnesses had seen him leaving the woods near the site of Victor's body. One officer noticed red marks on his cheek and ear, as well as broken twigs on the back of his coat. Further investigation revealed that Chikatilo had been accused of inappropriate behavior while teaching and had traveled to Moscow at the time of those murders. On November 20th, 1990, Chikatilo was finally arrested, but it would take over a year and a psychological breakthrough before he confessed to the full extent of his crimes. Officers were surprised to find he seemed completely ordinary. He was married with 2 children and held a university degree. He entered the interrogation room slouched, wearing large glasses, graying hair, and the demeanor of a tired middle-aged man. He spoke calmly, but offered no specific admissions. Though investigators pressed him hard, it was difficult to get inside his mind. He repeatedly rehearsed confessing, only to claim innocence at the last moment. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky was brought in. Alone with Chikatilo, he quickly recognized the man from his profile. While we don't know the full details of their conversation, much can be inferred from his life story. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, in Yablushne, now part of Sumy, Ukraine. The Stalin regime and war plunged the region into famine and misery. Starvation led to desperation, and stories of cannibalism emerged. Andrei's mother told him that his older brother Stepan had been taken and eaten. However, no official record of Stepan's existence has ever been found. During World War II, Andrei's father, Roman, was drafted and later captured as a prisoner of war. In 1943, while Roman was still in the army, Andrei's mother gave birth to a girl, Tatiana. At the time, it was tragically common for unaccompanied women to be taken advantage of by German soldiers, and it's likely that Andrei may have witnessed such repulsive acts. Reaching puberty, Andrei found himself unable to perform sexually, despite his interest in girls. He was ridiculed when an ex-girlfriend exposed his impotence. To escape the shame, he moved to Kursk and became a factory worker. After another failed relationship and military service, he returned home, only to be mocked again for his condition. He contemplated ending his life, but chose instead to move to Rostov, where he would later become infamous. In 1963, he married Feodosia Odnacheva. Despite their challenges with physical intimacy, the couple eventually had 2 children, Ludmila and Yuri, through alternative means. In 1964, he enrolled at Rostov University to study Russian literature and later became a teacher at age 34. Struggling with his own limitations, Andrei grew increasingly bitter at the idea that young couples were enjoying a closeness he was incapable of. He was highly educated and believed he was better than others, viewing his condition as deeply unfair, which fueled his descent into predatory behavior. He would lure students into classrooms alone under the excuse of talking about their grades, and then he took advantage of them. Multiple complaints reached the school board, who simply fired him instead of contacting authorities. Fleeing once more, he moved with his family to Shakhty, about 47 miles from Rostov, and found another teaching job where no one knew his past. His wife eventually learned of his behavior, but chose to stay. Unbeknownst to her, he had acquired a remote property, a secluded spot ideal for carrying out his horrific plans. During the interrogation, after discussing his life, Dr. Bukhanovsky began reviewing the crimes. Though the exact details remain unknown, Andrei soon confirmed he was the one responsible. The official document listed 36 murders, but before signing, Andrei confessed to an earlier killing. Lena Zakotnova, a 9-year-old from Shakhty, murdered in 1978. Tragically, someone else had already been convicted and executed for that crime. Andrei claimed he initially blindfolded Lena, believing her eyes would retain his image. In later murders, he instead removed the eyes. He proceeded to describe over 30 murders in detail. Though he never admitted to cannibalism, investigators never ruled it out. Following his confession, Andrei led police to many of the graves and reenacted the murders. In total, he confessed to around 56 murders, with 53 considered credible, 31 female victims and 22 male. He described taking pleasure from their screams, begging, and the sight of blood. To him, the victims were nothing more than objects to fulfill his twisted urges. Totally disconnected from his victims' pain, Chikatilo channeled his sexual frustration into violence, killing over 50 people in the process. At trial, he was visibly distressed, especially when confronted by victims' families. The evidence was overwhelming. 222 volumes of material, including photos and profiles. He blamed everyone but himself: Stalin, communism, war, bullying, in an effort to lessen his guilt. He behaved erratically, hoping to be declared insane and sent to a psychiatric facility instead of receiving a death sentence. Psychiatrists diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia and sadistic paraphilic traits, but ruled him sane enough to stand trial. He was fully aware of his actions and only feigned insanity to avoid justice. On October 14, 1992, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was convicted of 52 murders and sentenced to death. 2 years later, at age 57, he was executed with a single gunshot to the back of the head and buried in an unmarked grave within prison grounds. Chikatilo was a diabolical serial killer and one of the worst humans to ever walk this earth. No amount of trauma could ever justify the grotesque scenes uncovered by investigators or the more than 50 families he destroyed. He cowardly hid behind the facade of a normal family man while secretly leaving behind a trail of horror. His swift execution may not have silenced the screams of his victims, but it certainly prevented more. If this story stayed with you, please consider subscribing, hitting the like button, and letting us know in the comments which forgotten victims or overlooked cases deserve to be told next.